Final Fantasy XIV is the grandest story in video games. But maybe I'm getting ahead of myself. Before making such a bold claim, I should probably explain what Final Fantasy XIV is. Final Fantasy XIV is a fantasy MMO that's been around since 2013. Technically, it's been around since 2010 and was rebooted, but I'm not going to get into that history. Despite the 14 in the title, Final Fantasy XIV is its own self-contained game. The Final Fantasy games are not connected to each other story-wise, so you're not missing anything about the story or lore by passing on 1 through 13 or any of the various spin-offs. Final Fantasy XIV sees the player in the role of the Warrior of Light, a player-created avatar. The Warrior of Light is a member of the Scions of the Seventh Dawn, a sect created to protect the land of Eorzea from those who threaten it. And as you can imagine, there are a lot of bad eggs that want to threaten it. Being an MMO, Final Fantasy XIV traditionally releases expansions every couple of years. There are 4 expansions in total now: Heavensward, Stormblood, Shadowbringers, and Endwalker. A 5th, Dawntrail, is launching soon. By the time you watch this video, it might already be out. In a lot of other games, the expansions are self-contained stories that can be enjoyed separately from the main quest. Final Fantasy XIV isn't really like that. The expansions are direct continuations of the base story, A Realm Reborn. Plot threads, lore, and characters develop from expansion to expansion, with one leading naturally into the next. A good analogy is the drama TV series. A Realm Reborn is the first season of the show, Heavensward is the second season, and so on. If you sit down and commit to watching a TV show, you're not going to just watch the first season. Unless, of course, you don't like the show. But my point being, you don't consider the first season a complete story in of itself. In the same way, Final Fantasy XIV's A Realm Reborn through Endwalker is a singular story. Endwalker, I believe, is a rare, satisfying ending for an MMO story. So even though there is more to come, there is a complete story to be had right now in Final Fantasy XIV, so to speak. Even though I'm looking forward to what's coming next, I would have been happy with it ending with Endwalker, if that makes sense. This saga is the focus of the video. Okay, going back to my claim that Final Fantasy XIV is gaming's grandest story. The first easiest point to make is the game's sheer length. Each of the expansions, and strings of quest lines that link the expansions together, each run at least 50 hours. That means there are 5 full-length RPG games worth of story content. It took me over 300 hours to beat Endwalker, and that is mainly focused on story quests. That's 3 or 4 Baldur's Gates stringed together. The sheer scope of the story is just mind-blowing, and it's hard to even imagine writing a coherent and engaging narrative that spans that length. I guess I could end the video here, case closed with the easy layup, but I didn't say Final Fantasy XIV was merely the biggest. I said it was the grandest. There are far more interesting things to focus on than length. The lore in Final Fantasy XIV is more compelling than just about any game I've played. That largely comes down to how well the lore is integrated with the rest of the plot and characters. It truly connects you to it, unlike any other game I've played. Final Fantasy XIV also has a huge cast of characters. More than that, there are few games that have the number of characters that are fleshed out to the level that Final Fantasy XIV's characters are. There's an intricate attention paid to each character's development that feels organic throughout the course of the game. The wide array of villains, too, is varied and interesting, and they're the perfect foil to our friends throughout the story. I'm going to go into each of these elements, the lore, your companions, and your enemies, and explain just what makes them work so well in Final Fantasy XIV. However, nothing is free in life, and that goes for this game as well. The grandness of Final Fantasy XIV's story, and the compelling way that it's told, comes at a cost. And I think that cost may be too much for some players to endure. I'll explain why at the end. Before I go further, I'm going to give a spoiler warning. I'm aware that this disclaimer is going to come across as a bit long-winded, but it's important to me. I tried to make this video so that if I could go back and watch it as someone who had never played, I wouldn't feel like it spoiled anything that would compromise my enjoyment of the story. However, spoilers are a subjective thing. People's line on what a spoiler is varies, especially with a game as long as Final Fantasy XIV. So, because of that, I want to give some specific disclaimers. If you don't care about this at all, I left a timestamp to skip to the next section. In this video, I'm going to speak broadly about the plots across the expansions, who the villains are, what their motivations are, that sort of thing. I'm also going to speak about the lore, mainly things that are revealed throughout the game's base story. That may sound like a big spoiler, but A Realm Reborn is about 1/5 of the story at this point, so I don't personally consider it much of a spoiler. Without some of this base info, some of the points I try to articulate wouldn't be very coherent. I will also outline the broad trajectories of some character arcs in order to demonstrate how characters grow. Lastly, I will be showing cutscenes and footage from later expansions. Sorry for that long-winded disclaimer, but I just want to make sure the right people see this video. I'd hate for anything to be spoiled, but at the same time, I think this video could be helpful to someone who wants to learn more about the game, either to play for themselves or merely out of curiosity. And I also think it's something fun for Final Fantasy XIV veterans to reminisce on. One last quick plug. I'm a science fiction writer and I have a series of post-apocalyptic novels called the Northfield Saga. They focus on a man who's forced to assassinate a target, but he doesn't know his target holds the key to saving the world. If you want to support me further, please consider checking the series out. A link is in the video description. Okay, now we're ready. Let's begin with the lore. Final Fantasy XIV has some of the best lore out of any game I've ever played, but the true secret sauce of what makes Final Fantasy XIV's lore come alive is how it's delivered. Final Fantasy XIV delivers lore better than any other game I've played. Discovering new lore, even when it's something that happened thousands of years ago, always ties closely in with the immediate plot or characters within. This gives the lore a very keen sense of agency. The lore feels like it truly matters. In addition, the lore feels like it's a natural part of the world because we're seeing its effects on the characters and narrative. I know some of this sounds a bit vague and nebulous, so I'm going to use a few examples. The first is the dragon and human conflict, the Dragon Song lore in the Heavensward expansion. In a nutshell, the dragons and humans have been at war for thousands of years. The protagonists, notably Ser Emmerich, Lord Commander of the Temple Knights, are trying to stop this never-ending conflict. At first, it's a very frustrating endeavor. The dragons treat humans with a contempt and hostility that feels stubborn and obstinate. We're just trying to help, and they can't seem to get it through their thick heads. As the plot unfolds, you learn more about the origins of the conflict, and how it escalated over the years. The dragon's mistrust of humans begins to feel not only understandable, but also warranted. Likewise, you witness the dragon's devastation on humanity over the generations. From the humans' point of view, they haven't done anything wrong. Their villages are burned down by dragons they've never met. The dragons feel truly evil in their eyes. But herein lies the problem. You see, the dragons are essentially immortal. The dragons who were wronged personally are still alive. Evils were directly committed against them. The humans now are unwilling to understand or forgive though, because what their ancestors did thousands of years ago is ancient history. They don't deserve the dragon's wrath. The lore provides the context required to understand the human and dragon's motivations. A lot of humans resist Ser Emmerich's fight for peace. Why wouldn't they want revenge on an enemy that hurt them when they didn't directly do anything wrong to warrant it? Furthermore, the lore enhances the weight of the conflict. The war is intractable. How are humans and dragons ever going to see eye to eye when their perspectives of the conflict are so far from one another? It feels like you're fighting against a current powered by an uncrossable ocean. The impossibility of this situation makes you respect those fighting for peace like Emmerich even more. Furthermore, you want to learn more about the lore because therein might hold the answers to stopping the conflict. So the lore in Heavensward spans back to ancient history, but this ancient history is also inextricably linked to the plot and the characters within. Because of this, the lore feels important and also alive. Another example of the lore being interwoven with plot and characters is with the Shadowbringer expansion's antagonist, Emet-Selch. Emet-Selch is an Ascian. Ascians are a shadowy cult of beings that are essentially immortal. If an Ascian is killed, he will return to his body eventually. They work in secret, bringing calamity and strife to regions, plotting across decades and centuries. They aim to cause enough destruction to bring about the ruination of the world. This is to bring back their fallen god Zodiark. I'm fudging some parts of that summary on purpose, but you get the gist. They seem like a pretty standard video game cult. Bad guys do bad things in order to summon an evil god. You've heard of that one before. Emet-Selch initially seems like yet another Ascian, aiming to bring about the world's destruction, even though he's perhaps a bit more clever and charismatic than his brethren. However, throughout the course of Shadowbringers, you learn more about him and his past. Not just his past, however, you learn more about the world thousands upon thousands of years ago. In most games, the lore of the world this long ago would be interesting factoids that you would find in an old dusty book. They might explain how the world ended up the way it is, but they don't usually go further than that. In Shadowbringers, the history of the world is not only pertinent to Emet-Selch's past and how he ended up here, but it's critical to his current motivations. This thousands of years old lore is what powers his steps. Furthermore, it adds a lot of color and complexity to his character. As I mentioned, Emet-Selch seems purely evil when you first meet him. The more you learn about him though, the more that changes. He's a man with a great burden, an impossible burden.
Long have I awaited one who might brave a path of lesser tragedy. A resilient soul able to endure the necessary pain. I dare to hope that my wait is over.
This lore is beyond fascinating too. I don't want to get into it much to avoid spoilers, but throughout Shadowbringers I was chomping at the bit for every new story quest because it meant I might learn more about this history, which often subverted my expectations. It's not many games that keep me on the hook to learn about the mysteries behind their worlds, even more so than the main plot. I think that's a testament to how interesting Final Fantasy XIV's lore is, and even more than that, the compelling way in which it's integrated into the characters and story. The lore feels important, and it imbues the world with a sense of history that feels authentic. So Final Fantasy XIV crafts one of the most interesting worlds in video games, and the way you learn more about the world also enhances it. But what good is a world if it's not one you share with friends? As great as the lore of Final Fantasy XIV is, and how engaging the plot can be at times, the true beating heart of Final Fantasy XIV's story is its characters. What makes this story truly feel like a journey isn't the progression of plot events, it's the time you spend with the characters in this world, and how you see them grow and change. And that all starts with the Scions, your primary companions throughout the game. The Scions of the 7th Dawn are an order that transcends political and geographical lines, with the sole aim of safeguarding and shepherding Eorzea's future. In particular, they protect the land from the primal threat. During your adventures in Eorzea and beyond, these are the companions at your side. For the hundreds of hours of main story quests, you get to know these characters. You see their strengths and flaws, and watch them overcome the latter. Take one of my favorites, Alphinaud. He is a young man. He is brilliant in many respects. His tactical and political acumen rivals even the most talented rulers despite his young age. Despite his brilliance, despite his ability to weave his way through the tangled webs of political intrigue and social upheaval, he's an idealist.
Crises like these are the very reason why this alliance was formed. It is our duty to aid our fellow man.
My duty is to my country and my people. If you expect us to place the welfare of a foreign power above our own, you're going to be sorely disappointed. Lest you doubt, Limsa comes first, then the Alliance, and finally, circumstances permitting, Ishgard and the rest. If you cannot understand so simple a concept, then you have no place at this table.
He's a boy that lets his ideas, his vision for what he wants the world to be, cloud his better judgment. He makes mistakes. He miscalculates people's character. He endures the weight and consequences of his failures. You fight alongside Alphinaud as he learns lesson after lesson, and through the pain of hardship you see his growth. Alphinaud is brilliant, but he's not wise. At least, not at the beginning of the story. You see him grow from boy to man over the course of the story. Because in the main quest's great length, you spend a lot of time with Alphinaud. His growth feels natural, so much so that you might not even notice it in the moment. But when you look at his wisdom and pragmatism in Endwalker, his clear eyes are apparent in comparison to the beginning of your journey. This very slow, very natural feeling of growth isn't unique to Alphinaud. This pattern is found in all of the main cast. It's a pattern not only seen with character growth too. This slowness and this deliberation also goes to getting to know the characters. Much like people in real life, the Scions do not spill their inner secrets, their inner selves to you right away. Only when they truly feel comfortable with you do they allow you to peer deeper into their lives. When the Scions are introduced in A Realm Reborn, they in fact feel somewhat bland. The game doesn't tip its hand on any of the characters. It doesn't get to let you know them, not until the time is right. Not until the moment feels earned. Thancred, another Scion, initially comes across as your generic rogue archetype. Aloof and smooth of tongue, he acts like the world can't faze him. Throughout the main quest, you slowly start to witness and understand Thancred's deep love and care for others, especially for one Scion in particular. It's meaningful because it feels genuine. He's the type of man who cares for others in secret, and it pays off.
That you should be indifferent to her loss is no surprise. But to us, she was a friend. The best of friends.
Well, if that's the type of person you're dealing with, then you wouldn't expect to see their sincerity or care for other people right away, would you? Once more, it's this deliberateness with the characters, the intentionality in making them feel real first and foremost, that makes the payoff so rich. This patience, this willingness to wait, is something that few games have either the time or confidence to do. It's a great risk, one that Final Fantasy XIV is bold enough to take, but I think it pays off here. The characters are what make Final Fantasy XIV's world truly breathe. The lore is interesting, but the characters are what make the world worth caring about. This excellent character work extends past your inner circle of the Scions. Throughout the Scions' journey, they encounter many characters who are the stars of a certain expansion or story, but they're not characters that are consistently present throughout the Warrior of Light's journey. These characters too are handled with great care and nuance. I'll go over some of my favorite examples. I talked about Sir Emmerich earlier, and well, I'm going to talk about him a bit more here, especially his role in the Heavensward expansion. Sir Emmerich is the Lord Commander of the Temple Knights in Ishgard, the city-state entrapped in the Dragonsong War. Ishgard is a heavily stratified society, with a great emphasis put on birthright. The power in Ishgard is held largely by the High Houses. Sir Emmerich reached a high position in Ishgard, becoming the Lord Commander. However, unlike most of his contemporaries, Emmerich did not reach this rank by birth. In fact, Sir Emmerich had a disgraceful birth, and this has followed him around like a ghost throughout his life. Sir Emmerich's loyalty to Ishgard and his steadfast love for its people, despite the difficulty of his circumstances, is what makes him so likable. Yet this difficulty is what also enables Sir Emmerich to see through the dogma instilled by the High Houses in the Holy See, the religious institution that also holds great power and influence. Sir Emmerich is not a man blind to his people's problems, having been on the receiving end of them. I think this is best summarized by a quote from Sir Emmerich himself. Do you know what sort of man becomes Lord Commander of the Temple Knights? One who comes from good stock. I did not, yet here I am. Now why do you suppose that is? Because I swiftly learned to tell the difference between words, deeds, and beliefs. This clarity makes Sir Emmerich the perfect man to bridge the gap between humans and dragons. He loves his people, yet he's also not blind to their problems. He's learned discernment. He's an easy man to root for, the perfect man to climb up the great mountain of adversity that this war is to reach peace. Yet at the same time, Sir Emmerich's upbringing is fuel for his enemies, especially the higher-ups in Ishgard. He's bucking dogma. He's bucking societal norms, beliefs people have had for centuries. The heresy is made even worse by Sir Emmerich's birth. For those who take stock in bloodlines, Sir Emmerich's line is tainted. Of course, tainted ideas would come from this man. So, despite Sir Emmerich's nobility, his presence also fuels a lot of the conflict and strife in Heavensward. This is the masterwork of Final Fantasy XIV's characters. Sir Emmerich is complex, interesting, and likable. He's simultaneously a perfect fit for the expansion. His personal conflicts and identity weave so naturally into the surrounding plot and world. Characters like Emmerich that the Scions meet along their journeys and befriend add so much to the locations they inhabit. These characters and locations all combine to create a rich tapestry that only grows richer and more intricate the further you journey into this world. Lord Hien is another one of my favorite characters, and he's most prominent in the Stormblood expansion. In Stormblood, the land of Doma has been taken over by Garlemald and has been occupied for 20-odd years. Garlemald is an imperialist, expansionist empire which serves as one of the game's long-running antagonistic forces. Lord Hien is the heir to the throne of Doma. He aims to take that nation back for his people. He's a natural leader with an easygoing charisma that gravitates others to him. You immediately see why men and women are willing to follow him into battle. Above all, he cares for the well-being of his people. He puts them first, and this self-sacrificing nature is also most manifest when you first meet him. Lord Hien is willing to offer himself to Garlemald if his people are unwilling to fight. If they do not have the will to resist, he does not want to arbitrarily put them into harm's way. As far as these qualities go, Lord Hien and Emmerich are the same. However, there's one crucial difference between them. Lord Hien was born into his position. Doma is his birthright. Everyone sees him as the rightful ruler. While this may initially make Lord Hien seem like a less interesting character because he lacks the same adversity as Emmerich, it actually serves to make Lord Hien shine in a different way. Sir Emmerich fought for his position to help his people, but he didn't have to. Leading men wasn't necessarily his responsibility. On the other hand, because Hien is the rightful ruler, it is his responsibility to rule. Throughout his journey, there is a great emphasis put on the duty he has to his people. His duty to his people truly must come first, before his own desires or his own aspirations.
I know I should have fled with the others after Father died, instead of blindly fighting on. It was reckless and foolish, and there was naught to be gained from it. Everything to lose, rather.
So although the two men seem to inhabit similar archetypes, they feel like very distinct characters, and their stories emphasize different difficulties and pitfalls with ruling. This contrast, I think, shows Final Fantasy XIV's adeptness with character nuance. There's a true understanding of what makes each character interesting and how their individual experiences feed into their motivations and struggles. Because I've highlighted two similar characters, I also want to highlight the great diversity in characters you meet throughout your journey. Another one of my favorites is the Crystal Exarch from Shadowbringers. He's a shadowy, mysterious man who has summoned you and your allies to help him and his people. There's a mystery surrounding him throughout your journey. He doesn't reveal his face to you or his true name. There's a goodness that emanates from him, so you feel like you can trust him, but at the same time, this mystery nags at you. He keeps his distance from you very purposefully. Eventually, you learn what he's planning, and the reason for him keeping his distance. I won't reveal anything more, but man, it hit hard. For me at least. Lord Hien and Emmerich are warm and welcoming. They wear their hearts on their sleeves. So the Crystal Exarch's aloofness and secrecy feel very different. Final Fantasy XIV has compelling friends and allies, from the familiar faces that endure the journey's entire expanse with you, down to the characters that are contained in certain stories. But often what makes heroes truly shine is the villains they fight. Final Fantasy XIV, fortunately, is not short of great villains. I've already touched on a few villains throughout this video, so I'm going to revisit some of them briefly. Going back to the dragons. They're not quite villains, they serve as antagonists in the story even though they aren't truly evil. In fact, as the story progresses, you empathize with them as much as the humans. Their leader, Nidhogg, is the only one that can be truly described as evil. He holds a burning hatred in his heart for humanity, and he's unwilling to let it go. In many respects, he's the ultimate culmination of the greater conflict between humans and dragons. The worst case scenario. The embodiment of hate, unable to be reasoned or compromised with. He won't stop until Ishgard is ash. He's a great foil to Ser Emmerich and our other heroes. They're unwilling to give up on their quest for peace. Well, Nidhogg is unwilling to compromise on his quest for annihilation. While he may sound like a straightforward villain, what makes him work so well is how he stirs up the other dragons, urging them to take up arms against humanity, or at the very least stay out of the fray. What makes this work is the dragon's understandable animosity towards humans. An evil entity like Nidhogg is hard to counter against when there's a nugget of truth in what he says. When a part of what he says rings true, well, how are you going to forge peace with the dragons? Especially when they have Nidhogg whispering into their other ear. Any good villain tests the hero's ideals, and Nidhogg is the ultimate test for our heroes, of whether peace is truly attainable. Lord Xenos is a very different type of villain. Instead of being characterized by hatred, he is instead characterized by apathy. Despite being the prince in Garlemald, and the man to inherit the throne one day, he really doesn't care about Garlemald or its conquest. He is tasked with the subjugation of Doma, Lord Hien's domain, but it's not a task he has any personal interest in. All he cares about is the fight. A good hunt is the only thing that gives him a semblance of joy. Opinions vary on Xenos. A lot of people think he's a bit too one-note. I, on the other hand, find him very interesting. One main reason why Xenos works is because he's usually paired with another antagonist with their own goals. In Doma, he's paired with Yotsuyu, the active viceroy of the region. Unlike him, she has a burning hatred for Domans and wants to crush them under her foot. Xenos uses her as he needs, along with the entirety of the Garlean Empire, to get what he truly wants. He sees a true challenger in the Warrior of Light, the fight of a lifetime. He's willing to do anything and everything to make that fight happen, and to make it as grand as possible. He's willing to do immoral research to become more powerful, or goad our heroes by doing atrocious acts. Xenos is a sheen black mirror. His lack of passion is a great foil for the likes of Yotsuyu and Lord Hien. Hatred and love are both forms of caring, while apathy is its absence. Another reason I like Xenos is that I think there's a bit more to him than what's on the surface. Underlying the apathy, there seems to be a deep well of loneliness. A life devoid of companionship has led to this abomination. This point isn't overstated, but certain lines of dialogue throughout the story hint at it.
What meaning there is to be found in the petty vicissitudes of your existence must be gleaned by you, and you alone.
His archetype is very similar to Kraven the Hunter, one of my favorite Spider-Man villains. A man defined by the hunt. Without the hunt, all that's left is the sadness and loneliness of the void. Kraven's last hunt, I think, holds a lot of parallels to Xenos' story. Whether you like or hate Xenos, he serves as a very different sort of villain to the likes of Nidhogg. Then we have Fandaniel. Instead of apathy, he's characterized by the bleakest form of nihilism, a nihilism so dark that it may envelop the world in its shadow. Fandaniel's a villain that I really came around to. At first, his nihilism and plain desire to destroy the world felt super one note, to the point of being banal. In fact, if you would have asked me at the beginning of Endwalker, I may have listed him as one of my least favorite villains. Somehow, I ended up really appreciating him. That's for a few reasons. First of all, his nihilism forces our heroes to face tough questions that they don't always have an immediate answer to. They have to face why they fight in the first place, their role in the world, and the purpose of it all. There are a lot of deep, nuanced conversations in Endwalker, and they are all spurred by the threat of Fandaniel. The second reason is that there is more to Fandaniel than what meets the eye. As you learn more about him, you see why he became the way he is, and that story truly is heartbreaking. I figured the game would try to pull something like that, and the fact that it works so well even with my expectation is pretty amazing. Finally, we have Final Fantasy XIV's best villain, Emmett Selk. I already spoke about him earlier, so I'll keep this part short, but I want to use him as an example yet again. Like Fandaniel, he initially seems like the personification of pure evil. He aims to destroy the very world to trigger the rejoining. I mean, as far as motivations, destroying the world is about as bad as it gets, right? Suffice it to say, our perception of him transforms from evil to tragic. He's a man cursed with a great burden, one he's had to carry for centuries and centuries. In fact, he's even a noble figure in a lot of ways. So, Final Fantasy XIV has a lot of compelling villains. They all share a similar pattern of being deeper than they initially appear. In addition, they each present a unique threat to our heroes. This threat goes past the physical and into the philosophical. With Nidhogg, we have to fight against a hate that, although evil, is justified in many ways. How do you stop the cycle of violence? With Xenos, we face apathy. How do you face the death and suffering caused by a villain to whom all of it is meaningless? With Fandaniel, we face nihilism. What's the point of fighting when we're all eventually going to die anyway? Why prolong the suffering? Emmett Selk wants to save something too. What do you do when his noble mission threatens to destroy you? Hate, apathy, nihilism, and contrasting worldviews. The threats in Final Fantasy XIV challenge our heroes in a variety of ways. Lord Hien wants the best for his people. When facing a villain like Xenos, who will reduce his people to dust without a second thought, is fighting him really in the best interest of his people? These challenges facilitate growth in our heroes. They force them to ask hard questions they don't want to ask because they might see a hint of something about themselves within. These villains facilitate us learning more about each of our friends on a deeper level. They also encourage our friends to grow in their own flaws in order to rise to the occasion. Like the lore, the villains truly work towards fleshing out the world and our characters, and make the journey with them truly feel like a mountain that's being climbed. So, I've spent a whole lot of time going over what makes Final Fantasy XIV such a compelling story. One of the key reasons I've touched on is Final Fantasy XIV's willingness to take its time. The game establishes itself slowly. The lore is revealed gradually. Characters, when you meet them, often don't feel very engaging. It's because you don't know them yet, and like a real person that you don't know, you don't have insight into the particulars that make them stand out and bring them to life. You see the surface level traits, which for characters often can make them feel like generic archetypes. The noble one, the roguish one, the studious one, and so forth. The same pattern goes for the villains. When I describe the villains, you may have noticed a pattern emerge. The villains could seem to be one note until you learn more about them.
I just want to destroy the world. But please do resist with all your might. It will add to my enjoyment.
Final Fantasy XIV doesn't hurry to flesh out its character's story or lore. It instead waits until the opportune moment strikes. This results in the characters feeling more genuine and the lore feeling more integrated with the story. But there is a significant cost to this patient approach, and that is the game's pacing. Final Fantasy XIV takes a really long time to get going. This is most egregious during the base story A Realm Reborn, and the quest leading up to the first expansion Heavensward. A Realm Reborn is all about laying the foundation for the rest of the game. It introduces you to the main scions, but because there are so many characters, you don't really get enough time for any of them to step out of the basic archetypes they belong to. The basics of the lore is introduced, but it doesn't really grab you. The Ascians play a large role, but you don't know much about them aside from being a shadowy, nebulous organization, so they feel generic. The plot is a fairly straightforward conflict with the Garlean Empire, which is trying to harness an ultimate weapon. However, all of this groundwork is in service to the larger story. Because the wider cast is introduced here, later stories can each focus on one or two scions and really flesh them out. Through the lore, the world stage is introduced, with the various nations and their cultures, beliefs, and conflicts. Ether, the energy that powers living beings, is introduced, as well as primal summoning and how Ascians are interested in harnessing it. In later stories, we spend more time with these various nations and learn more about their nuances, see them face trials that test their beliefs, and engage each other in interesting ways. The greater lore of Ascians is established, to be fleshed out and in some cases entirely subverted. Point being, the groundwork laid here produces fruit in later stories. However, I wasn't really engaged with Final Fantasy XIV's story until Heavensward, which you can probably tell by how much I've talked about Heavensward in particular in this video. Well, technically a little bit before Heavensward grabbed me, but I don't want to spoil those events. A Realm Reborn feels dry, and even worse, you can start to lose the plot amongst the small fetch quests and missions between the story moments. I would say it takes about 70 hours to reach Heavensward. That means you have to wade through 70 hours of dry storytelling before it becomes truly engaging. That is a massive time investment to ask out of anyone, just to reach the point where they can truly give the story a chance. To put it into some perspective, that would be like asking someone to watch 140 episodes of a half-hour TV show just to get to the good parts. I finished the entire Mass Effect trilogy, a trilogy lauded for its story, in the time it took before Final Fantasy XIV became engaging. I stuck with Final Fantasy XIV through the dry parts because I heard this story was worth it. I heard it was just that good. And after beating Endwalker and some quests after it, I would agree. I think my time with the game has been fully worth it. Despite being one of the best stories in games, and perhaps the grandest in terms of scope and scale, it's a story I can't recommend to everyone, because it's not a story for everyone. Not everyone can afford that much time just to see if they like a story. The pacing might be far too slow for some. Perhaps Final Fantasy XIV could trim some of its content to improve the situation. There are some fetch quests that I don't think I'd miss for sure, but these changes would merely be band-aids. The fact is, A Realm Reborn and all the slow parts throughout the game like it are in service to the greater story. The slower moments make the bigger, more explosive reveals hit that much harder. The time you spend getting to know your friends in the game, the more time you spend getting to know the world and growing from what you once thought it was, and the time you spend getting to know your enemies, all feed into Final Fantasy XIV being a true bona fide journey, with all the excitement and lulls that a journey provides. As a writer myself, something you learn along the way is that storytelling decisions have costs. Balancing plot, characters, lore, and pacing is a difficult task, and you can't often have everything you want all at once. In my own stories, there are times that I had to cut out exposition to improve the pacing, or I might sacrifice some level of pacing for a character moment that will pay off later in the story. Every story, and every writer, balances that line differently. The way Final Fantasy XIV balances that line is uncompromising and unique. Its focus on plot, characters, and lore at the detriment of pacing is certainly not for everyone. But throughout the story, once the groundwork has been established, the plot picks up and everything balances out. These various elements begin to move together in a wonderfully coordinated dance, which is one of the best performances a game has to offer. Final Fantasy XIV is unwilling to compromise on the story it wants to tell. It pays the cost unflinchingly, willing to make a story that isn't for everyone. But in that effort, it crafts a story that resonates even more deeply with a great number of people, including me. Final Fantasy XIV is a game that asks a lot out of you. But because I had to give for the game, I feel like there's a part of me within it, if that makes any sense. There's something to be said for variety in storytelling. There's a kind of beauty in short stories, and there's a kind of beauty in longer stories. The fact that each of us resonates differently with different types of stories is what makes them so fun to both experience and talk about. From this video, you might consider trying out Final Fantasy XIV, or you might not. Or you might have already played and be watching this video to reminisce. But no matter what, I hope I've relayed, in part at least, what makes this game so special to me. Thanks for watching. If you liked the video, please consider liking and subscribing. It really helps out the channel. If you want to support me even further, please check out my Northfield series. I have a passion for telling stories of my own, and it would mean the world to me if you could support my work. Either way, it means a lot that you made it to the end of the video. This was a special one for me. Until next time.